this very exciting discussion webinar that we have prepared for you this afternoon in Europe and still this morning in North America, where we are joined by David Castagnetti, who's a partner at DGA Group, and here in London we've got Luke, who is a leading economist at Aberdeen Asset Management. This year, 2024, is the year of the global elections. There have been 60 countries who've held political elections this year, with over 2 billion people registered or potentially registered to vote. But I think we're all in agreement that this is really the one that matters. The US presidential election for 2024, and I'm delighted that we're holding this webinar today at a time where it really is starting to get very interesting. We've had changes in candidates, new debating styles, and I'm really pleased to introduce David, who will be giving us a US overview of what the word is on the street in North America and in Washington, the views, and then Luke will be coming in second and giving us his thoughts on what the possible outcomes might mean for European and global stock markets. So without further ado, please do, as we're going through, add your questions, which we will pick up on at the end. So first off, we're going to have David, who is a renowned public policy and business strategist at DGA Group in Washington, giving his views, and then Luke will come in second. So without further ado, I'm going to step aside and leave the floor open for David to introduce his thoughts of what is going to be the chaos and the consequences of the US general election. David, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Fraser, for the kind introduction, and thanks to James Melville Ross from our London office for the introduction to you and to the Edison Group. Really appreciate it. I'm really honored to be part of the panel today with Luke. I feel very fortunate to be able to, I've already learned from him just kind of going through some of the preliminary stuff. So thank you, Luke, as well. I think as we look at the chaos and consequences of the U.S. election and the multiple elections that we've had over the last few years, right? It's safe to say that the United States is very partisan. It's partisan on mainly cultural issues right now. That's our biggest challenge, I think, that we have as a country. You either live in a red state or a blue state, and that's kind of where you reside and the way you look at the world. My goal today is to try to help explain it, and more importantly, kind of help to look into the future of what some of the consequences may be. So I want to do an overview of what's motivating U.S. voters in the world that we live in the States. What issues are Trump and Harris speaking about? And finally, just spend a couple minutes talking on kind of what are the potential geopolitical consequences, especially those that CEOs have to navigate. And as we look at kind of the world that we're all living in, I kind of see three buckets. And growing up Catholic, Monsignor Vaghi always told me I had to put things in threes. That was just the way I was taught. So I kind of look at three major trends: technological trends, geopolitical trends, and society trends. When we look at technology and we think about the original desktops that we have, and think about how much power has changed, including the fact we can do a webinar with, or I can do a webinar with folks all over the world today, that's pretty impressive. And when we think about what AI is going to bring to that change as well, is just simply amazing, right? And not only just on the simple things like using ChatGPT or Perplexity, but what it means for many of the member companies that we represent, right? We've had massive changes technologically in the last 40 years. Geopolitically, when we step back to what we think about what the world was, in the geopolitics, we clearly had the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, East meets West. We were kind of going to be one world moving forward. It was all about free trade and how the world was going to be integrated. And then fast forward to today, another kind of 40, 50 years of what's happened. We now are confronted by three major geopolitical crises, right? We have obviously the right in your backyard, the Russia-Ukraine war is taking place, and how is that handled and what's going on with that? We have the Israel-Hamas conflict as well, and kind of what's that meaning for voters. And then more from the U.S. perspective, one of the biggest challenges is how do the U.S. and China compete both economically as well as potentially militarily, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for many of the supply chains that many of our clients operate in, and how do you handle those related issues? Third bucket that's happening in the United States. In the 1970s, for the most part, the United States was about 75, 80% white. It was very driven by a white suburban culture. Dad would go to work, mom would stay home with the kids, and dad would commute back and forth. Today, we live in a very, very different world. It is what I call a modern family, right? We are much more interracial. We have gay couples that are part of our families. We have multiple marriages that have taken place. So you've seen a whole new change of the way society operates. And most interestingly, when you look at the United States, according to the U.S. Census, by 2040, the U.S. will be a minority country. And our two biggest states, California and Texas, already are. So you can kind of see where we're going on a cultural basis. The second thing that's happened is the trust in the institutions that have protected us, the church, government, media, big business, organized labor. There's been a massive degree of lack of trust in these institutions. These institutions, instead of helping us, are out to get us, right? And the only one that's moved in the positive direction is our military. And I think that's a cultural thing, because most of us have family, friends that are part of it, and we feel like that's one of the greatest assets that the United States brings to the world. Finally, the last thing I would say is someone can introduce me to the 10% of people who think Congress is doing a good job. I would love to meet one of them, because I never have, other than an elected official. Let's get into the elections now. The interesting thing as you think about what's happened over the last couple of months, if we had this conversation 60 days ago, we would be talking about Joe Biden, Donald Trump race, two 80-year-old white guys taking kind of running against each other. That world has changed very much, right? We now have first ever African-American woman, Asian-American woman on the ticket, but more interestingly, it's part of a generational change, right? On the other side of it, the Republicans are kind of doubling down on their MAGA image, their Make America Great image, and bringing J.D. Vance onto the Donald Trump ticket is a generational change for them, but it's in a way of reinforcing kind of what Donald Trump is, what he believes. When you look at the last 60 days of what's happened in presidential politics, the headlines have gone from the indictment of our first president ever, felony indictments, Joe Biden debating Donald Trump and dropping out of the race, Kamala Harris becoming the Democratic presidential nominee in a very different kind of process for the Democrats to elect, Trump having a second potential assassination attempt just literally the other day. And we've had two different debates with presidential candidates who are different candidates. Think about, now what I want to talk a little bit is about the voters that both campaigns are running. This quote is from a New York Times article in 2022 about the 2022 elections, but it is incredibly relevant today. And what we're going to go through are some of the issues that really show that Democrats are talking to one type of voter, the Republicans are talking to another type of voter, right? And the way I would simply say it is the Democrats are talking basically to voters who think change is too slow. Republicans are talking to voters who think change is too fast. Our system is very different, right? We don't elect our president on a basis of a total number of votes. We elect them on the basis of the Electoral College. Every state has a different amount of electors that they send. Ultimately, what will decide this race are 7 states will determine who the next president of the United States will be. When you look at the states in the northern part of the map, those states are basically whiter and older and losing population. The states in the southern part of the country that are highlighted there are much more diverse, much younger. It's basically where the economic growth and the population growth of the United States is going. I would say of all these states, the one to pay most attention to is who wins Pennsylvania. That's the challenge. That's the place that the candidate has to win. The polls, 2016 told me to become very skeptical of polling and what polls mean. The race is clearly a dead heat on a very macro level, again, in terms of raw numbers. But on the other side of it, where it really matters are in those 7 battleground states and kind of what the outcome is in those states. And those states are also very, very close. Notice I leave a lot of space open on this chart. There's a reason why. There's a long way to go in this election, even though vote-in mailing has begun in a handful of our states in the United States today. The issues, no surprise, the Republicans are basically running on immigration and inflation. Our borders are out of control. Inflation is very high. And by high, I mean in the 4 to 5% range. That's what they're going to challenge Harris on. She will be tied to Biden in that sense, since she is the sitting vice president. The other thing you'll see a lot about is what we're calling woke capitalism, and the Republican push back against what woke capitalism is and ESG is and all those related issues. To a degree, if you just step back, the Republican House was able to, because of a hearing that they had in Congress, was able to get the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia to resign. So they see some movement very much in this space. And what kind of pressure may they put on corporate America moving forward as well? The Democrats, on the other hand, are going to run a very different campaign. It's going to be very focused on women's health related issues, very focused on the Inflation Reduction Act and the success we've had with moving manufacturing back into the United States. They'll talk about some of the provisions that they did in healthcare on the enhancing Obamacare, as well as climate change and civil rights, right? Many areas where Europe is driving the train on already. The specific groups that are going to be targeted, again, when you look at Harris, she's going to focus mostly on female voters. Donald Trump's going to focus very much on male voters. The number one determinant, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is are you college educated or not? If you're college educated, you're probably a Democrat. If you're non-college educated, you're probably a Republican, right? She's going to focus on women, women's health, abortion. She's going to figure out a way to increase young voters again. She's going to figure out another way to turn out voters who are not likely voters. On the other side of it is President Trump is going to look at, what I call the bro vote, kind of younger, hip 18 to 25-year-old men who see something in this nationalism and populism that's rising. He's going to try to increase his vote with black men. He's going to look very much at religious Hispanics and Hispanic men specifically. That's what is going to try to be his new coalition that gets him over the top. Remember, due to technology, what I know today is I want my voters to vote, your voters to stay home. So how do I convince my voters to come with me and at the same time to dissuade voters of your party from coming out? The other thing that's happening, which I just have to mention, is we've had a great deal of disinformation taking place. This is no different than, I think, what we're seeing in worldwide elections that Fraser mentioned at the beginning, right? The Russians, as best we've been able to tell, have already spent about $10 million in getting social influencers and becoming part of the character of X and other media. China is doing the same thing with what we're calling spamiflage, right? They're hacking accounts and sending out messages from those accounts to get voters either incredibly frustrated or continuing to push the envelope a little bit. In Iran, we've seen Iran actually hack Harris and Trump staffers and kind of where they are. So that is kind of an interesting piece that's taking place. Where Harris and Trump are going to be similar and different, what I would think about is kind of China supply chain issues, de minimis tariffs. Those issues will be basically the same under a Harris administration or a Trump administration. Defense spending will continue to creep up as well. There'll be a lot of work on trade and how do we continue great trade with our allies, but potentially put some restrictions on people who are kind of not our allies, or near friendshoring, as we're calling it, or nearshoring, right? Those type of issues. Where they're going to be different are going to mostly be on social issues in the U.S., immigration, climate, diversity and inclusion, our alliances with Ukraine and other global alliances that I'll go into at the end of the presentation. The one place that's most recently been updated that is there another difference is going to be crypto. As you may have seen today, Trump announced his new crypto company that he's creating in a branding space. So that'll be rather interesting. A few geopolitical considerations I would just raise. As Fraser mentioned at the beginning, this has been a year of elections. Nationalism and populism is alive and well throughout the world. There are some new faces that have been put into the world leadership. There are still some old faces that are there, but you can kind of see the change that's also taking place and what may that mean moving forward. As I look at it, I kind of think about a triangle and from a U.S. perspective of one of the greatest challenges that we have in dealing with China. How does the U.S. continue to cooperate with Europe and its other Asian allies to deal with China, both in an economic perspective as we look at tariffs and electric vehicles specifically? How do we kind of keep the pressure on the Chinese to kind of allow us some access potentially to their technology, as well as kind of putting not an oversupply into the marketplace, as well as how do we deal with China in terms of its relationship with Taiwan and the Philippines now that we're starting to see some new military type related issues as well. So there's been an interesting change that's taking place, this new world dynamic that is both globally economic and potentially militarily. Finally, the last thing I would raise before I turn it to Luke are just kind of some of the BRIC countries and what are they doing, right, to grow their economies. because this is also an important piece of kind of the U.S.-China relationship. And what we're beginning to see from many of these countries is they're starting to look at, we're not going to just ally with the U.S., we're not just going to ally with China, but we're basically going to work with the country that gives us the best deal moving forward, right? And you've noticed that President Modi out of China, out of India, has had a state dinner both in China and in the U.S., right? So you can see the courting that is taking place there as well. So there are a lot of changes that are happening. There's a great deal of voter unrest. And we haven't even kind of got into the House and Senate piece that Luke will touch on as well, which will also enhance and drive some of these policies as well. So maybe with that, I will turn it over to Luke, and we will.
David, can I just thank you for that? That was great, and your timing's spot on. Can I just ask a question? I think many of European observers are asking: is Trump creating division, or is he just capitalizing on it?
That's a great question. It's probably my belief is in the way I'm going to answer it is every election since 2000, since the year 2000, there has never been consistent control by one party, except for 2 times in those elections. So in other words, in 12 elections we've had, 10 elections, one of there's been a balance of power, either in Congress or in the presidency, where the Republicans are in control or the Democrats are in control, right? Except for 2 times. The interesting thing, and the reason why I say that is there's a great deal of voter unrest. So what I believe is Trump is capitalizing on it, because Trump wasn't elected till 2016, so that change was already happening, right? So I think he's taking advantage of this cultural split that we have, and kind of adds fuel to the fire all the time to keep it burning. He's done it. We can agree with him or not agree with him. There is an interesting opportunity that he seized as a leader of this kind of MAGA type crowd that's there.
Thank you. Luke, okay, so we'll now hand over to Luke Bartholomew, who's the Deputy Chief Economist at Aberdeen Asset Management, and to give us some thoughts as to which outcome is going to mean what for various stock markets. So, Luke, we want to look into your crystal ball. Over to you.
Sure, thanks, Fraser, and thanks, Dave, for excellent presentation. So, looking forward to discussing that in due course. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Looking forward to hearing your questions as well. So, as you heard, my name is Luke Bartholomew. I'm Deputy Chief Economist at Aberdeen, and what I wanted to do today is, first of all, just start with a few observations on the state of the race as it currently is. Then talk a little bit about what we might be able to learn already about how the market is thinking about the different candidates. And then I want to give, perhaps deep dive is too grandiose a phrase, but at least a toe dipping dive into some of the main policy areas as they relate to markets and the economy, and we'll see how we do. So the place to start, I think, is just on this question of how voters are thinking about how different candidates might manage the economy. And the place to start, or the reason to start there, is not just because I am an economist, but famously, as James Carville said about the Clinton campaign, it is often the economy, stupid, that determines the outcome of US elections. And you can see on the chart on the left there that it is the economy that comes out by some margin as the issue that voters think is most important in this election. And then, as the chart on the right shows there, as things stand, Trump has a pretty consistent lead on that issue. For better or for worse, voters think Trump would be better at handling the economy. They often associate Trump with the quote unquote good days pre-COVID, where, to be fair, the economy was at close to full employment, inflation was relatively low, the stock market was quite high. Now, the extent to which Trump was responsible for those is debatable, but the point is that's sort of what's associated with him, whereas the association with Biden, and so therefore to an extent Harris as well, has been this period of inflation. And while inflation itself is, of course, much lower now, the price level is still significantly higher. So there is this sticker shock still when people go to the grocery store, wherever it might be, and experience the higher prices, and they blame the Democrats for that. And the reason for laboring this point is twofold. One, because, as I say, like, the economy is a crucial issue, and it's one of the reasons we think, as I'll get to in a moment, the race is basically a toss-up, despite the fact that Harris is currently leading on most national polls, that there are these structural issues that still favor Trump to some extent. But the other is, of course, that there are some concerns that the US economy is relatively close to a recession. Now, we're minded to think that those concerns are somewhat overblown, and the most likely outcome for the economy as things currently stand is more like a soft landing. But still, the fact that these kind of concerns are there in the bloodstream, they are being talked about, means that it's quite easy to see how the race could be, if there is message discipline from the Trump campaign, pivoted towards these economic questions where they have this structural advantage. So yeah, as I say, I think the best read of the race right now, despite the fact that Harris has this small, consistent lead in the national poll, and notwithstanding David's very good point that ultimately the race is determined in crucial key states within the Electoral College, but I think that national poll lead is somewhat telling. But still, the best read is that it's pretty much a toss-up, that it's 50-50, and it feels rather boring to say that. And you might say, well, you're just saying it's 50-50. There's no real content there. I want to stress that there is content to that 50-50. It is just the best assessment of how the race currently looks. For what it's worth, we were currently close to putting Trump at a 70% chance of winning a couple of months ago when Biden was still in the race and Trump was riding high. It did look like all the momentum was in Trump's favor. Things have swung quite significantly since then, and that's why I think it really does convey just how uncertain the race is, and it is an honest assessment of where the race is at to say it's 50-50, and that's what the betting markets show. That's the chart on the left there, and that's what most of the statistical models that various agencies and predictors, forecasters put out. There is one exception there, which you'll see. That's the model from Nate Silver, the famed forecaster, that has a bit more weight on a Trump victory. But to David's point, I understand what's going on there is the model is favoring Pennsylvania quite heavily in what's being pulled through there. And Trump did have a number of strong-ish polls there. Those have swung back a bit since. And I suspect as Nate Silver continues to update that model, that will get close to 50-50. So I think as things stand right now, it is a 50-50 race. It is entirely anyone's to win. Maybe Harris has the lead in national polls, but Trump has some structural advantages around this question of the economy, and also some inbuilt biases in the Electoral College as well, just given the kind of voting coalition that he is able to mobilize these days. But I should say, even if we knew who was going to win the presidential election, that wouldn't entirely resolve the degree of uncertainty around the policy outlook, because the kind of policies that either candidate can pursue will ultimately in part turn on the congressional results. And it's worth stressing here, actually, so that things like trade policy, that is something that the president can pursue him or herself. But tax policy, regulatory policy, that will need to go via Congress. And just as a reminder, in the congressional election, so the entire House of Representatives, that will be up for vote during the presidential election, whereas the Senate, it's a third of the Senate that's up for election every 2 years. And I think it's fair to say that the Democrats are facing quite a difficult map in the Senate this time round. So they currently have 51 of the 100 seats, so a small majority there. But they are defending more seats this time round, and 3 of the seats they're defending, West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, those are states that Trump previously won. So these are Republican-leaning states, and so there are good reasons for thinking that, particularly if people are mobilized to come out and vote during an election that they like Trump, that will influence the Senate as well. So it is a tough map for the Democrats to win the Senate. So what we have on the left there is just our subjective conditional odds of how that both the House and Senate would go under either presidential outcome. And kind of what we're trying to convey there is if Trump wins the White House, it's extremely likely that the Republicans will win the Senate as well. And maybe it's 50-50 as to whether the Republicans will win the House. But there is a pretty clear path to the Republicans having a full clean sweep of government. Whereas for the Democrats, that's a much harder path. Even conditional on Harris winning the White House, we still think it's more likely that the Republicans will hold on to the Senate. It's very likely that the Democrats will win the House in this Harris scenario, but the Senate will probably still remain in Republican hands. So it's more difficult to see how the Democrats end up controlling all levers of government versus the Republicans, where there is a clearer path. And I think that has implications for thinking about, if Harris won, what kind of policies are going to be pursued. Some of the more quote unquote market unfriendly policies around taxation, corporate taxation, and regulation, those might be much more difficult to pursue if she doesn't have Congress on her side. So that sort of leads me on to talk a little bit about how the market looks like it is currently thinking about either result. So what I've done there is a so-called event study. So what you do is you've got 4 different windows where the chances of the either presidential outcome seem to swing quite significantly. And so there's the original Biden-Trump debate, which was widely considered as a disaster for Biden, and so saw betting markets increase their odds of Trump winning quite considerably. You get things like the assassination attempt, which again, the first assassination attempt which again led to betting markets increase their odds on Trump. Then you have Biden pulling out, which saw betting markets reduce the probability of Trump winning, presumably on the basis that some other candidate, at this point it wasn't known, some other candidate other than Biden had a better chance of beating him. And then the most recent debate, which again was considered something of a Harris win, and so the probability of a Trump winning went down. And you look in each of those windows at how various different asset markets performed, and there's a sense in which that might give you some steer on how the market is thinking about those things. And I think there are some clear patterns that emerge from that. So one is that a Trump victory seems to be associated with higher interest rates. So both at the 2 and the 10-year point of the Treasury curve, bond yields seem to increase on the expectation of a Trump victory. The dollar seems to go up in a Trump victory kind of scenario, particularly against the Mexican peso there, but other emerging market currencies. And then on balance, it seems that the market wants to run with a Trump victory being modestly risk on for stock markets. I mean, there's a slightly mixed message across the 4 event studies, but on aggregate, that's what emerges, that the market is very modestly risk on a Trump victory. And in particular, it seems to be small cap stocks that perform best on expectations of a Trump victory, presumably around expectations of tax cutting and deregulation. And it's larger caps in the tech stocks in particular that were hurt, partly maybe to do with tech regulation, and partly also to do with the fact that interest rates, as I say, are sort of typically rising in this Trump winning scenario, and just this higher interest rate environment might be bad for tech stocks is sometimes the thought. But anyway, that seems to be the broad pattern that's emerging from how markets are pricing things at the moment. But there is an extremely big caveat I want to give to this, which is that these event studies have led us astray in the past. So I'm giving an example of an event study that was done back in 2016, so during the Clinton Trump campaign. And so similarly, what we have there is an event. In this case, it was an FBI dossier released. I mean, honestly, I can't remember the full details of the case. It was one of those things that no doubt at the time seemed extremely important, and with the richness of time, perhaps its importance has faded somewhat. But anyway, the point is that the news of this caused probability markets to quite significantly bring down their assessment of Clinton winning. And at the same time, stock markets fell, which was interpreted at the time as a signal that the market didn't like the idea of a Trump victory. When the probability of Clinton winning fell, so markets also fell. So that seemed to be the signal that was coming from those event studies back then. And then, as I'm sure you remember, outside of the first few hours of the results coming through, the first multiple months of the news of Trump winning turned out to be a risk on period. Stock markets performed really quite well, I guess, on the expectation of tax cuts and deregulation. So that event study back in 2016 proved not to be a very good steer as to how the market ultimately performed when the result was in. So that is the very big caveat to the event studies that I presented this time round. But I think that those are perhaps like the best single window that we can have of trying to understand right now how the market is thinking about the different risks. And I think it is worth just sort of interrogating a few quick policy areas to see if those market expectations do make sense. And perhaps the place to start is on fiscal policy, where both candidates are talking about quite expansionary fiscal policy. In the case of Harris, it's more about tax credits and extending most of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed under Trump, not all of it, but a fair majority of it. Whereas Trump, it's the full extension of those tax cuts, along with further tax cuts on top of that as well. And perhaps it's worth putting those measures in the broader context of US fiscal policy, which is what the chart on the left-hand side tries to do there, which, I think it's well known that US debt to GDP levels are high and rising, but we've run various simulations of shocking interest rates higher, shocking growth lower, running a more expansive fiscal policy. And the truth is, it's not that difficult to come up with scenarios in which the US fiscal position is not sustainable on even like the most weak definition of sustainability, which is that debt isn't increasing without bound. It's quite possible that there is some level of sustainability that kicks in below that, but presumably everyone agrees that if there is no upper bound on how much debt will increase by, that is the pure definition of unsustainability. And yeah, it's not difficult if you shock interest rates or fiscal policy a little bit to put the US on that kind of pathway. Now, that's not to say that, you should be worried about a US fiscal crisis. Right now, I don't think you should. There are all sorts of structural reasons why US debt is different to anything issued by the rest of the world, and all sorts of reasons to think that, if we did find ourselves on one of these nasty paths, policy would start to respond. But that is the context in which these expansive fiscal policies are being introduced. And as you can see on the right there, as I said, both campaigns are pushing policy that does increase the deficit. But in the case of the Trump policies, if taken seriously and literally, offer the most significant increase in the deficit, caused the greatest widening of the deficit, put most upward pressure on the debt level. So I do wonder whether the market is right to think of tax cuts this time round in quite the same way it did in 2016. Back in 2016, the deficit debt situation wasn't nearly as bad, and interest rates, crucially, were much lower. So perhaps right now there's this sort of Pavlovian sense of, well, tax cuts are good, particularly corporate tax cuts. That's good for the market. It was true last time. Why would it not be true this time? I think one reason why it might not be true this time is the fiscal situation is very different. And there might be reasons for thinking that the market is rather less open to the idea of such aggressive fiscal easing this time round. And I think that, by the way, explains some of the reason that interest rates, both short and long-term rates, are expected to rise in these event studies under a Trump presidency. And then related to that is the trade policy, which, to remind you, to pursue this kind of fiscal policy that I talked about, either candidate would need probably both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House, to be able to push that through. Whereas on trade policy, Trump can do most of this from executive order. So this is the kind of stuff that could happen even if the Republicans don't end up winning the House and Trump wins the White House. You don't need as much to happen for these kind of outcomes to occur. And on trade, Trump is talking about quite a material increase in US protectionism. So the chart on the left there just shows how the average tariff level increased under Trump during his first campaign, or his first term, I should say. Now, it is worth noting that the Democrats under Biden didn't undo almost any of that. They sort of accepted much of that existing protectionist infrastructure for good and for bad reasons. But the point is they didn't materially push it higher. What Trump is talking about as the red dot there shows, it's the level of tariffs that we would get to if everything that he talked about in the campaign was pushed through. And on China, it's sort of well known that this would be a material increase in tariffs, and the Chinese sort of know this and they're preparing for it. I think one part of the global economy that needs to perhaps be a bit more prepared is Europe and the EU. That Trump has quite a mercantilist view on trade and thinks of trade in terms of winners and losers as manifested in deficit. And the US is running quite a large trade deficit with the EU. And, if Trump just has those figures put in front of them, particularly in the context of some of his concerns around NATO and freeloading there, I do think that he might have serious thoughts about what the appropriate degree of protectionism to put on Europe would be. And China has been through this already, has some dry powder policy wise to respond, and perhaps is more up for having a trade war. I do wonder whether Europe is quite as prepared as what could be coming. And then just all I wanted to show on the right there is just, I'm sure it goes without saying, but these kind of protectionist measures, trade war kind of rhetoric, this is not market-friendly stuff, despite the fact that the stock market performed well during Trump's first campaign on all days where we tended to get news about trade war, tariffs coming through, extra protectionism. Those were down days for the market. There's a clear market signal that it doesn't like those kind of developments. And then finally, just on monetary policy, I guess one of the things that probably most spooked financial markets about the possibility of a Trump presidency, or one reason to be perhaps a little bit less sanguine than what the event studies are currently showing, is that Trump has talked about having more of a role in setting monetary policy. Now, there are quite serious institutional checks that make that difficult. In principle, he could, in time, appoint new governors and a new chair on the Fed. The chart on the left shows there that actually, if you just waited for everyone's term to expire, he wouldn't get a chance to do that. Like, it's quite deliberately set up that these terms are very long to avoid the president having power over that. But I kind of feel that that's a somewhat institutionalist mindset. If Trump really is minded to shake up and reform the Fed in that way, there are plenty of tools at his disposal that don't just rely on waiting for these people's terms to expire. And perhaps the area where that really bites is going to be on dollar policy, because I think one of the through lines of his policy agenda is the kind of things, as we talked about, that would tend to put upward pressure on interest rates in the dollar. And that's not what he or his policy advisors want. They tend to favor a weak dollar policy. And it's not obvious how they go about getting that weak dollar, given what's likely to happen to interest rates and monetary policy if left to its own devices, given the other policy choices that Trump would be making around tariffs, around fiscal stimulus, and the like. And so, there had been this talk of maybe there'd be another great conference to try and, weaken the dollar as occurred in the 1980s. You can sort of see on the chart on the right there, that big run up in the dollar in the mid 1980s, and it came back down again after some accords between the big industrial nations to try and engineer a weaker dollar. I just don't know that we live in a world anymore where that might be possible anyway, just given the scale of financial markets, but also just like the extent of American leadership and goodwill that existed in the 80s just isn't in place anymore, I think, to be able to engineer that kind of allies agreeing to quite serious changes in exchange rates. So again, a possible source of friction with trade partners, and quite unconventional policy could end up being pursued if his advisors are quite serious about the dollar. So that maybe all sounded like quite a lot of negative spin on the Trump policy proposal, which I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, is that as things stand right now, the market is quite comfortable with the idea of a Trump presidency, and it does seem to be modestly risk on. I just think it is worth kicking the tires of some of those views, because looking at some of the policy areas, it's not obvious that the extrapolations from last time, where Trump was unambiguously risk on, are going to be true this time around. So happy to leave it there and hear where your questions take the conversation.
Luke, thank you. That was extremely succinct and thorough. I think I'm still on slide 4, trying to catch up with the amount of information that you've shared with us. Thank you. There's lots of interesting questions coming in, and one I'll start with is in regard to a comment you said earlier around the potential for US economic slowdown, and there's sort of people are talking about recession. Obviously, that's pre any interest rate cuts. If you were to follow the indicators and there is a potential slowdown, is it better under Trump or Harris from an economics point of view? So Luke, that's to you.
Yeah, is it better under Trump or Harris? Difficult question. I mean, I think in first order terms, there's probably more stimulus coming under Trump. As I showed there, like the deficit gets bigger under Trump. He is talking about quite significant tax cuts. He's also talking about deregulation. And those are the kind of things that we would think would push up on growth. Now, against that, there is the trade agenda, and it's pretty clear that aspects of that the market doesn't like and will push up prices and will hit sentiment and confidence. And the other thing to say is, like, it's not obvious that what the US is screaming out for right now is more fiscal stimulus, given the debt situation and given where interest rates are. So my sense is that if Trump does end up winning and pushing through this kind of very expansive fiscal policy, which, as I say, your first guess should be that supports growth, probably what ends up happening is that monetary policy has to tighten into that you get a less rapid cutting cycle than you might otherwise do, or indeed perhaps a reversal of that cutting cycle. And I think, given that a lot of asset market valuations are dependent to some extent, or at least predicated on interest rates coming down quite a lot, I would be somewhat concerned about that interest rate shock. So my best guess is that the Trump stimulus ends up being a lot less beneficial than it might seem at first guess. Now, that being said, I think it's also clear that, if Harris comes in and does do big corporate tax increases, does the anti-price gouging laws or whatever it might be, does have a much tighter regulation on certain sectors of the economy, energy in particular, then that would also hurt growth as well. I just think she probably won't have the policy space to do that. Like, Trump can do a lot of market unfriendly stuff just by winning the White House. Harris needs to have Congress as well to be able to do that other sort of less market friendly stuff around tax and regulation. Brilliant. But David, I'm interested if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think one, I agree with your assessment. Two things I would say. One is, to your point about the markets factoring in President Trump could be president. It's unlike 2016, where no one believed that he could. I think this time the markets have seen it and they probably agree with it. I do think what I would say in terms of the politics is, the Harris and going after kind of raising the corporate rate back to 28%, I think will be a big push of hers. To your point, the challenge is kind of who's controlling Congress, right? If the Republicans have the Senate, that is incredibly unlikely. And she's going to need a sweep, right? She's going to need to control both the House and the Senate to get some of those policies done. Again, where I do come back to a little bit is on the tariff piece. Trump is at a much higher level, especially with the Chinese on the 100% tariffs, that kind of thing. But you're going to see further, like Biden put into place the other day, the de minimis tariff rules. You're going to see more pressure, I think, take place on kind of some of the smaller tariffs, especially going at China, and how does that potentially affect the economy. The last thing I would raise on that is just in the merger and acquisition space is, the Department of Justice, I believe in a Harris administration, will be pretty aggressive in reviewing antitrust laws in the US. Trump will be based on individual companies, but it still will be part of any process that people have to think about in terms of their economic growth and kind of how are they dealing with the legal and political implications of a merger and acquisition as well.
David, I've got another question here that I think is most appropriate for you to lead on, but how big a mistake was it for Trump to hold the first debate with Biden? Did he hold it too early?
Did Biden hold it too early, you mean?
No, well, Biden. We see what. No, but for Trump, that's kind of like, that's a big change of the whole structure of the election, isn't it?
Yeah,
it was a result of that debate.
Yes, it totally changed the dynamic of the race, right? It was Trump was the young guy, Biden was the old guy. Now Trump has become the old guy and Harris is the new guy, right, on the stage. So you're seeing a different dynamic taking place. Probably in retrospect, to your point on Trump, he probably would have said, no, let's do the debate, sometime in mid to late October. So there wouldn't have been enough time for this transition to take place, right? And you think about the way that the interesting thing as a political observer of this is how seamless from Biden to Harris the transition was pretty fascinating, right? I mean, the primaries had already ended. Clearly, Biden had the delegate votes. He decides to step out. Harris captures the delegates to become the nominee without an electoral process, which, by the way, that if President Trump loses to Harris, you will hear a lot about how she was not an elected person through the primary process, but she played a total inside baseball game with the delegates to the convention, right? That's going to add a little fuel to why this was a rigged election against them. So I think this was really very, very significant about what happened. And, my facetious comment about Biden is he probably, in retrospect, would have both liked to seen it delayed as well. So, but it is what it is, very out of the process, but very much the way Trump thinks, right? Trump is a very anti-process institution kind of person. That's his appeal. And that's, that's one of the consequences that we've lived in this election already.
Thank you. Luke, another question that's come in here that I think is probably best for you to start with. I mean, I think the US is the largest international investor in the UK stock market. Do you think that, given some of the commentary that we're hearing that you've given us, that's likely to increase in the next, post the election?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that US investment in the UK is probably more a function of the UK's economy and asset opportunities rather than the US itself. I mean, it is true that if we get a stronger dollar following the election, which is quite plausible, and especially under a Trump scenario, that's the kind of thing that makes UK assets look cheaper, right? And we have seen in periods of quite pronounced sterling weakness that international investors and US investors in particular have come in and taken trophy assets or just increased their investment in the US. So that's one way in which the election might affect capital flows, the exchange rate thing. But more broadly, I think of the question of capital coming into the UK as much about the UK's domestic picture. I mean, what is interesting in the UK right now is maybe we're in a slightly different cyclical spot to the US. The US growth is slowing. How much it's slowing is open to debate. Some people think it's recessionary slowdown. We're not minded to say so, but the direction of travel is clear that it's slowing. Whereas the UK had its recession last year, small technical one, but a recession nonetheless. Right now, growth is actually reasonably strong. So yeah, there's this sense of US growth slowing, UK growth somewhat stronger, and I think that's going to mean that the interest rate environment in the UK and the US diverges. At least in the near term, the Fed looks set to embark on a really quite rapid easing cycle, perhaps as much as 50 basis points from tomorrow, whereas the Bank of England likely to be much more gradual. And so that interest rate differential that could open up, I suspect, might be another source of why capital could come into the UK. Perhaps UK rates and returns start to look a little bit more attractive for that reason. But of course, there is then the question of how much the upcoming budget changes any of that. But perhaps that's the subject of another webinar. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And David, another question I think is appropriate for you. I think there's the vice presidential debates coming up shortly. Do they matter, or are they just a sideshow?
Good question. What I would say is they matter in terms of the political rhetoric of kind of the insiders, the reporters, the political types who really pay attention to the detail. Do the voters pay attention to the vice presidential debate? I think they'll tune in a little bit, and they'll probably be just to put it in perspective. The Harris-Trump debate had just about a little over 70 million viewers. My guess is the vice presidential debate will have somewhere around 30 million viewers, somewhere 35 million. So people will pay attention to it. Will it drive voters or not? I don't buy that. Where the vice presidential pick does matter is what are they doing in the smaller markets. So what do I mean by that? Is J.D. Vance going to Scranton, Pennsylvania and doing some kind of event and capturing the media market there? Is Tim Walz going to Eau Claire, Wisconsin and capturing the media market there for a couple of days, right? So to me, I think it's more kind of what are they doing below the radar screen? The debate will give them a chance to raise their profile, tell their story, make people feel that they're okay to be president of the United States if, God forbid, something happened. But at the end of the day, I think it's more what I would say, Fraser, to use one of my baseball analogies, an inside baseball game than it is a voter baseball game.
Thank you. That's interesting. We'll have time for one more question. So I just got one here that's the significance of postal voters.
Yeah. I
think there were, if I'm right in remembering, there were 160 million votes in the last election. 42% of those were postal. So does that mean is campaigning over? Does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, some states have already begun their mail-in voting. Right, this week was the first week, and I think about a half a dozen states that it's taking place. It's changed the game. Right, again, the ability for my voters to vote. Right, you know who those voters are. You've knocked on the door. You've captured them. You want them to put their ballot in as soon as possible. If you turn back, note if you turn back to the 2020 election, remember Donald Trump told his voters not to vote by mail, to go in person. Vote by mail was rigged. Guess what? He's not saying that today, right? Voters, it's a different process. The game has changed. You've had to up your media buys way earlier because you're not buying in just in the months of September and October. You're buying in August and September as well. Your door knocking strategies moved up that much quicker. It's really been a big game changer. And the ease of voting also changes the likely voter in the United States, right? All I have to do is mail my ballot back because I've requested it. It's pretty simple. I'm at no one's schedule. And oh, by the way, it's not only mail-in vote, but it's early vote. Most states now also, for about a month before the election, you can go to various polling places and cast your ballot in person before election day. So that number is only going to get greater. It's not going to get less.
Excellent. Thank you. We've come up to the hour that we were allotted, so I'm going to have to very sad. I think there's more questions and there's an awful lot more that we could all discuss, and maybe we could pick this up after the election, and we can revisit the slides and see how it all panned out. But
we don't want to be held to that high level. How about new slides?
We could start again. But listen, a big thank you from me on behalf of the audience who joined us here for the Edison the webinar, to Luke and David. That was great. I'm going to just ask one parting question for both of you. So, with the Magnificent Seven as being the big driver of stock markets in the last 12 months, who's the better president for that continuing, Harris or Trump? Well, David, you go first.
I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to say it's Harris, only because she has a longer term relationship with the tech community as a whole. Because of coming out of California, it's more, she's just more familiar with it and not going to be, I think, as antagonistic to it, because they agree with her, I think, overall a little more politically.
And Luke?
Yeah, agreed. It's probably Harris, also partly to do with interest rate dynamics as well. But I mean, it is worth noting just how many of the tech bros are getting behind Trump right now, though, which again, perhaps that's a subject for another webinar. But yes, to answer your question, it's Harris, I think.
Those tech bros are important right now too. He's using it well.
God, they've got deep pockets for funding, haven't they?
Yes,
they really do. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's been absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested to see what comes out, and Luke, maybe it will be 50-50 right up to the wire. We'll wait and see. So with that, I'm gonna close the webinar. If anybody's got any further questions, please do add them, and I'll see if I can get them passed on to the panel, and we can share them later. Otherwise, I will close the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sure.